On September 18, 2025, the world watched with bated breath as history unfolded in real time. From bustling city squares to quiet living rooms, millions tuned in, their eyes fixed on the screens, waiting for a decision that could alter the course of a conflict and, perhaps, the fate of countless lives. In the heart of New York City, the United Nations Security Council convened for an extraordinary session. The agenda was urgent and clear. A resolution calling for an immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, a region battered by years of violence and uncertainty. As the roll call began, one by one, delegates raised their hands in favor. 14 out of 15 members stood united, a rare and powerful display of global consensus, transcending political divides and national interests, all in the hope of ending the suffering. But then, in a moment that seemed to freeze time, the United States, one of the Council's 5 permanent members, raised its hand, not in support, but in opposition. With a single gesture, the U.S. exercised its veto power, instantly blocking the resolution and overriding the will of the overwhelming majority. The chamber was plunged into silence. The air grew heavy with disappointment and disbelief as the hopes of millions, both inside the chamber and far beyond its walls, were dashed in a single decisive moment. For many, this was a painful déjà vu. It marked the 6th time since 2023 that the United States had used its veto to block action on Gaza, reinforcing a pattern that has frustrated diplomats and civilians alike. The sharp crack of the gavel echoed through the chamber, signaling not just the end of a vote, but the abrupt closure of a desperately sought window for peace. For many, it felt like a door slammed shut on the world's plea for an end to the violence. Diplomats who had spent weeks, even months, negotiating every word of the resolution sat in stunned silence. Their faces reflected exhaustion, frustration, and a deep sense of loss, knowing how close they had come to consensus. The image of the U.S. delegation, isolated amid a sea of agreement, spoke volumes. It was a stark reminder that even the strongest international unity can be undone by a single nation's opposition, especially when that nation holds the power of veto. In Gaza, families gathered around televisions, clinging to a fragile hope that relief might finally be on the horizon. But as the news broke, that hope was extinguished, replaced by a familiar sense of despair and abandonment. In the end, the lone veto echoed louder than the voices of 14 nations. It was a moment that underscored the immense power and the profound consequences of a single decision on the world stage. The resolution was a carefully crafted 3-part plan. First, it demanded an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire. No delays, no preconditions, no more temporary pauses. Second, it called for the unconditional release of all Israeli hostages held by Hamas, recognizing the pain on both sides. Third, it insisted Israel lift all restrictions on humanitarian aid, so food, water, and medicine could reach Gaza's starving civilians. The resolution was not a final solution, but a vital first step to halt the violence and address urgent needs. Its authors believed these demands, ceasefire, hostages, aid, were inseparable and equally urgent. The world saw it as a lifeline, not just a political statement, but with the veto, even this first step was denied. The Security Council's structure gives 5 permanent members, the US, UK, France, Russia, and China, the power to veto any resolution. Even if 14 nations agree, a single veto from one of these 5 blocks everything. This system, designed after World War II, was meant to ensure consensus among major powers. In practice, it means one nation can override the will of the world. In the Gaza vote, the U.S. veto nullified overwhelming support. Critics argue the veto is undemocratic, paralyzing the Council in moments of crisis. The Gaza conflict has reignited calls to reform or abolish the veto. Many now question whether the Security Council can fulfill its mission to maintain global peace. The power of one has left millions powerless. Gaza, once vibrant, is now a landscape of ruins after nearly 2 years of relentless conflict. Israeli bombardment and occupation have left civilians trapped in fear and deprivation. Famine grips Gaza City. Children suffer acute malnutrition, families scavenge for food, and hospitals are overwhelmed. Aid convoys are blocked, clean water is scarce, and disease spreads rapidly. The social fabric is unraveling under the weight of hunger and despair. The UN resolution was seen as a lifeline, not just politics. Aid workers warn without a ceasefire and open borders, famine will spread. The situation is now a humanitarian catastrophe, not just a crisis. The Security Council's failure to act is, for many, a failure to prevent mass suffering. The world's inaction is costing lives every day. After the veto, Algeria's ambassador, Amar Bendjama, addressed the chamber and the people of Palestine. He apologized for the council's failure, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Forgive us," he said, "because this council could not save your children, more than 18,000 killed." Bendjama compared the council's inaction to its failures during the Rwandan genocide and Srebrenica massacre. He warned that history was repeating itself, with the world again failing to stop mass atrocities. His words were a powerful indictment. The veto was not just a policy dispute, but a moral failure. For Algeria and many others, the council had failed its most basic duty, to protect the vulnerable. The apology was a rare public admission of impotence in the face of tragedy. Algeria's sorrow was echoed by others in the chamber. Pakistan's representative called it a dark moment in this council, capturing the sense of moral failure. China accused the U.S. of abusing its veto, arguing it was used to protect an ally, not global peace. Denmark, speaking for the 10 elected members, reminded the council of the worsening famine and destruction in Gaza. The veto, she said, was a rejection of a desperate humanitarian appeal. The overwhelming support for the resolution showed near global unity. But the lone veto revealed the council's deep fracture. Frustration grew, not just at the vote, but at a pattern of paralysis on urgent crises. The chamber's reactions were not just diplomatic. They were cries of anger and sorrow for the future of the international order. The U.S. defended its veto, arguing the resolution was flawed and would help Hamas, not peace. American counselor Morgan Ortagus claimed an unconditional ceasefire would let Hamas regroup and threaten Israel again. The U.S. insisted any peace must remove the threat Hamas poses or risk endless cycles of violence. The humanitarian crisis, they argued, was caused by Hamas's tactics and aid distribution failures, not just Israel's actions. Israel's envoy echoed this, saying only military pressure would free hostages and ensure security. For the U.S. and Israel, security was paramount. A ceasefire was seen as tying their hands. They argued the resolution, though well-intentioned, was naive and dangerous. Their united front blocked the world's call for a ceasefire. The U.S. veto sent shockwaves of frustration and sadness worldwide. In living rooms, cafes, and public squares across continents, people watched in disbelief as hopes for a ceasefire were dashed in an instant. The news was met with tears, anger, and a deep sense of helplessness, as many realized that the suffering in Gaza would continue unchecked. The near-unanimous vote had sparked hope that the world would finally say, enough. For a brief moment, there was a sense of unity, a rare alignment among nations demanding an end to the violence. People from all walks of life, regardless of nationality or background, felt that perhaps this time, the international community would act decisively. The veto shattered that hope, fueling anger and a sense of injustice. Demonstrators poured into the streets, their voices echoing the pain of those trapped in conflict. The sense of betrayal was palpable, as many questioned how one nation could override the will of so many. Protests erupted in cities around the globe, editorials condemned the decision, and many accused the U.S. of choosing politics over people. Social media platforms lit up with outrage, as activists and ordinary citizens alike demanded accountability and justice for Gaza. The Security Council, created to prevent such tragedies, was rendered powerless. Its chambers, once symbols of hope and diplomacy, now seemed hollow, echoing with the frustration of those who believed in its mission. Many now question the UN's relevance. If it can't stop a famine, what is its purpose? Critics argue that the organization's credibility is at stake, and that its inability to act in moments of crisis undermines the very ideals it was founded upon. The disconnect between diplomatic maneuvering and real suffering in Gaza is stark. While leaders debate resolutions, families in Gaza face unimaginable hardship, their lives shaped by decisions made far from home. This was the 6th U.S. veto on Gaza since 2023, deepening perceptions of double standards. Each veto chips away at trust in the international system, leaving many to wonder if justice is truly possible for those most in need. America's standing, especially in the Arab world and global South, has suffered. The veto has fueled anti-American sentiment, with critics arguing that U.S. foreign policy prioritizes strategic interests over human rights and humanitarian concerns. The frustration is not just about one vote, but a betrayal of the UN's founding principles. For many, it's a painful reminder that the promise of international cooperation and justice remains unfulfilled, especially for those who need it most. With the Security Council blocked and no consensus in sight, the fighting in Gaza is set to continue for the foreseeable future, leaving civilians trapped in a cycle of violence and uncertainty. As the conflict drags on, the humanitarian crisis will only deepen. Families are forced to flee their homes, children are left without schools, and basic necessities like food, water, and medical care become even harder to find. Aid agencies will keep trying to deliver relief, risking their own safety to reach those in need. But the scale of suffering is overwhelming. Without a ceasefire and open borders, their efforts are stymied by restrictions and ongoing violence, leaving many desperate for help that cannot reach them. Supporters of a ceasefire resolution may now turn to the UN General Assembly, hoping to apply moral pressure and rally global opinion in favor of peace. But the Assembly's resolutions, while symbolically important, lack legal force and cannot compel the warring parties to stop fighting. Some countries may consider imposing sanctions or taking other diplomatic measures, seeking to pressure those involved to change course or come to the negotiating table. Yet, without the backing of the Security Council, such actions have limited impact and may not be enough to shift the situation on the ground. Meanwhile, the United States faces mounting international and domestic pressure to reconsider its stance, as calls for a ceasefire grow louder from both allies and citizens. The fate of Israeli hostages remains a critical and emotional factor, fueling debate over military action versus negotiation, and shaping the choices of leaders on all sides. If military pressure fails to achieve its aims, calls for negotiation and diplomacy may grow stronger, with mediators seeking a path to de-escalation and lasting peace. Ultimately, hope rests on the warring parties recognizing that a military solution is impossible and that only dialogue and compromise can end the suffering. Until that realization comes, the world watches anxiously, following every development, hoping for a breakthrough, and fearing for those caught in the crossfire. In the meantime, people everywhere bear witness, raising their voices and demanding that humanity, compassion, and peace prevail over politics and violence.